Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello, everybody. It's Thursday, the 22nd of January, 2026. Whoops, that was a slip. Next week, we have an interview with the historian, the Michigan-based historian, Heather Ann Thompson, who has an interesting new book out called Fear and Fury, the Reagan 80s, the Bernie Gertz shootings, and the rebirth of white rage. And as it happens, my guest today has written a history about the same subject, 5 Bullets, the story of Bernie Gertz, New York's explosive 80s, and the subway vigilante trial that divided the nations, written by Elliot Williams, the Washington, D.C.-based CNN legal analyst. And the book is out this week. You have a week jump, Elliot, on Heather Ann Thompson, so I expect you to outsell her. But in all seriousness,
oh no, I don't know about that.
Well, you're right. It'll be like one of those kids' soccer games where you'll all get medals.
Everybody gets a medal, yes.
But in all seriousness, Elliot, what does this tell us? I know both of your books are trying to analyze not just recent American history, but its relevance to today.
Right.
What is the fact that you two very distinguished journalists, writers, historians have chosen the same subject and have books coming out within a week of one another? What does that tell us about history, the ironies of history, the paradox of history?
Oh, yeah, the old is new again. And I think I think it's safe to say that both Heather and I touch on is this idea that many of the issues that characterized that 1984 shooting are still ripe today. Whether it's media bias, polarization in the country, public safety, and crime in cities. And if you've literally opened up a newspaper or turned on a television in the last 12 months, you've certainly seen that how safe cities are is a defining issue in the United States of America right now. And also vigilantes and what happens and how people are allowed to take their own safety or public safety into their own hands, even sometimes at the expense of violating the law. All of those things are still very ripe today. So it should shock no one that multiple writers are looking back at the same incident from 41 years ago with a refreshed eye.
The events that you write about are the 1984 New York City subway shooting carried out by Bernie Gertz. Very briefly, Elliot, not everyone will be as familiar, certainly, with this story as you are. Tell us what happened that infamous day on December 22nd, 1984.
So what I can tell you is what is not in dispute. The only things that are not in dispute are that, number one, Bernard Getz shot 4 black teenagers from the Bronx, ran or fled to New England, came back, and was heralded by many in the public as a hero, as a bit of a hero, and ultimately went on trial and was convicted of not any violent crimes or not assault, not homicide or attempted homicide, but of illegal gun possession. He then went on and was sued by one of the 4 victims for a lot of money that he didn't pay. That's all that's not in dispute. We're all in agreement about that. Everything else, Andrew, is subject to hot debate. Everything from, was Getz threatened by one of the young men? Did the young man approach him in a group? How scared was he? Did he intend to kill? Did he wish to kill? In all of and on down, was he a hero of sorts or a villain and sort of a bigot who was lashing out sort of with a sense of malice? All of these things have been hotly debated for decades and decades, and very little. And that's perhaps the most surprising thing or the most interesting thing about reporting the book for as long as I have, is that there's very few hard truths to the story of Bernie Getz.
You're a CNN legal analyst. That's your day job. You have a law degree. Is that the most interesting thing then for you, Elliot, in writing this book and taking up this project of the undetermined legal consequences? Is this another trial of the century, another O.J. Simpson, another Scopes trial?
That's a wonderful question, Andrew. And I think there's a few things going on there. Certainly, my being a former prosecutor and lawyer was part of what made the case interesting to me. But stepping back, I realized that, number one, I grew up just outside the city. I was born in Brooklyn and grew up not far away from the city and lived this story firsthand as a kid. So part of really what draws me to it or drew me to it is revisiting a quite formative news and public safety story from my childhood. It really, just reviewing a lot of the old news clippings and media really took me back to Brooklyn or out just New Jersey, suburban New Jersey outside of the city 40 years ago that I remember quite vividly. And it really, for many of us who grew up in that era, shaped the way we see media and crime and race and the law and firearms and all of the above. We probably didn't know it when we were kids, but certainly that's the case now. So what I found far and away most interesting about it all is the story itself. And in the first about 100 pages of my book, 5 Bullets, what I really do is trace and track the story. It is a bit of storytelling, and it's tracking really these 5 people, the 4 victims and Bernard Goetz, that morning on through the day. Where were they and how did they end up on the train? Why did they end up on the train? Then some of the passengers, why were they there? And what brought all of these strangers together for this intensely traumatic moment that shaped all of their lives and with them, all of New York City.
Was there a Rashomon quality to it, Elliot? In other words, everyone has a different perspective. We all know or most of us should know the Kurosawa movie, which presents a murder from many different perspectives. In your experience, in talking to people, in reliving it, in reading everything that's been written about it, is it possible to come to a single truth on this?
Oh, no. And what's really funny, Andrew, is that I almost used the word Rashomon a moment ago, but I thought, is that too obscure?
You're allowed to use Rashomon. Any movie references to Japanese cinema on this film, on this show, and you can come anytime you want.
All right. So I'm keen on using references to Kurosawa.
Exactly.
Here, but absolutely. You are not the first person to reference Rashomon. In fact, a close friend of mine who read an early draft of the book said, you have written in effect, Rashomon. What you have is Rashomon, because it's the perspectives of multiple people, including, and I get to this in the trial a little bit, although the book doesn't lean heavily on the trial, I get to this a little bit, which is even the witnesses on the train were not in agreement about what happened. One of them in particular thought that Goetz had fired all 5 shots in rapid succession, bang, 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 bang. Everybody else thought it was bang, 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 pause, say something to one of the victims, something very threatening to him, bang. Right. So even that, it's a fundamental question. Was this a fit of fury and just a fusillade of bullets, or was it sort of a more deliberate thing? And even that was up in the air. And, we hear the perspectives of all of these folks and some of their different takes on what transpired.
Do you think it's possible to look at this case in I use this word carefully, a colorblind way? You're a Black American.
Yep.
The perpetrator of the killing was a white American. All 4 victims were Blacks. Is it possible to come to this in a colorless way?
I think people have tried. I think the jury tried and thought they did. And they if you interview or talk, I talked to one juror, connected with a couple others. If you talk to them today and if you read any interview from them, they will insist to the ends of the earth that race was not a consideration in any of their thinking or any of their approach to the case. It just simply can't be true. It simply is not true. One cannot deny, and I talk about this a fair amount in the book, one cannot deny that if the races of these people were switched, this would have been an entirely different narrative. If a Black man, even a professional engineer, upstanding citizen of the ilk of Bernard Goetz, shot for down on their luck white teenagers, this would be a totally different story. And the way the public reacted to it would have been a vastly different story. So I just push back on the notion, as many have tried throughout history, including virtually every supporter of Bernard Goetz. I've sort of pushed back on this idea and quite strongly on the idea that the whole notion was colorblind. In fact, as the judge, Justice Stephen Crane, who oversaw the trial, worked very hard to keep any recognition of race out of the trial. Now, as you know, and I detail this in a few chapters of the book, Five Bullets. But to an extent, he's right, because of the fact that it was not a civil rights trial where Goetz was not on trial for shooting people because they were Black. It's legally in the United States very fraught or very dangerous to start talking about race, either in jury selection or over the course of the trial. Very dangerous, and that can actually get the case thrown out. That said, he was so gun shy about it that he actually ended up letting the defense have many wins that they should not have had at trial. And at least in one chapter of the book, Five Bullets, I talk about one incident in which he allowed a staged recreation of the shooting, in which Guardian Angels, Curtis Sliwa's group, these four sort of thuggish looking Black teenagers came in and reenacted the shooting. Did not need to happen. And Sliwa, in my interview with him, made clear, we wanted to make the jury feel scared. We wanted them to perceive the sense of dread that Bernard Goetz did. If that's not stoking racial biases, not using the N-word or shooting fire hoses, but if that's not stoking racial biases, then truly nothing is. And so it is incomprehensible to me, no matter how hard people will try to say that we can actually look at this case in a truly colorblind manner.
How explicit, in your view, Elliot, were the ways in which the Reagan administration used this white rage to pursue its own interest? I'm going to play you a clip from my conversation with Heather Ann Thompson, who believes that the Reagan administration were quite explicit in using the white rage to pursue their political interests. So,
white rage is a very, very potent tool, and always has been in American history, to destabilize a political agenda that is more broad-based. It's one of the reasons why, going way back into labor history, that the way you stop unionization is you bring in Black strike breakers who then are scabs. You divide that group of people from one another. I mean, there is absolutely, irrefutable and deep history in this country of people stoking the flames of white racial prejudice, fear, resistance.
Elliot, what were, in your view, in your reading in White Bullets, what were the politics of this? Did the Reagan people jump in to pursue their own political interests, to take advantage of the broad white range that exists, a white rage that existed in the 80s, and some people would see as metastasized into the white rage of the 2020s?
Yeah. Now, to be clear, the focus of my book is not on the rage of white people. I will let other people, particularly white folks, have that debate. What I would say is, and something I do cover in the book Five Bullets, is in the small amount that I talk about Ronald Reagan, firearms and gun policy was in many respects driven by seeing Black people with guns. In fact, it is well reported and documented, and this is something I talk about in the book Five Bullets, that Ronald Reagan was actually part of what turbocharged his support for gun control or firearms restrictions was seeing Black Panthers heavily armed, protesting at state capitals around the country, particularly the state capitol, marching in Sacramento. Something about seeing Black men with weapons was far more troubling than the prospect of seeing white people with weapons. So obviously race is in the back of everybody's mind, but that's not, Reagan comes up in my book, but it's certainly not the central focus of it.
Lots of people come up in your book. Al Sharpton, some of the characters, Rupert Murdoch, they all are still around today, Rudy Giuliani. How important are these secondary characters in your narrative?
Central. And it's a few things. It's one, it's the notion that New York City has for a very long time been an incubator for national political and policy talent. Think about how many presidential candidates, even not necessarily successful ones, but people who, by virtue of having been in the crucible of New York City politics, went on to bigger and better things. Michael Bloomberg, Rudy Giuliani, Al Sharpton, Bill de Blasio ran for president for a short time. Mayors of New York end up on the cover of Time magazine, or end up with foreign policy platforms. Zoran Mamdani is a national figure right now, whether he likes it or not, because Republicans have made him into a little bit of a boogeyman. So, and the list goes on and on and on. Those are just the ones that came to mind for me. Now, what I was struck by in putting together the book 5 Bullets was the fact that so many big figures really used the story to their own aims and their own ends and their own growth. So it's really part of the origin story, I think, quite explicitly, of Al Sharpton and Giuliani. And
surprise, Elliot. Al Sharpton and Rupert Murdoch and Rudy Giuliani would pursue their own interests, take advantage.
Yeah, larger than life personalities. But just very quickly, I'll explain how Al Sharpton, and he said this to me in my interview with him, he feels that Tawana Brawley, the story of Tawana Brawley, a black woman, a black teenager who had faked a sexual assault by police officers, and it was a sort of big controversy in New York, that the Tawana Brawley story is what put Al Sharpton on the sort of global map. His point was that it was actually Bernard Goetz. He was a street level protester and community activist, but saw in the Goetz story an ability to highlight issues that were important to him, but also raise his own platform. So, so that's one. Rudy Giuliani was the U.S. attorney at the time, with his eyes on local, if not bigger local, if not national office, and saw this case, like so many others, as a way to burnish, or, to sort of strengthen his public and national brand. Murdoch is interesting, and I focus on this in an entire chapter devoted to the New York Post in the book 5 Bullets that I wrote. Rupert Murdoch actually purchased the New York Post in 1977 and really shifted the Post's coverage towards sensationalism about crime and safety issues, and really frightening people more than anything else, stoking this idea that we, quote unquote, are under siege and are being attacked, and that, the next horrific crime is just around the corner, so watch your back. And it drove an arms race between the New York Post, the Daily News, and Newsday, and other tabloids, the smaller tabloids in New York, really on account of the New York Post. And it carries on to this day. It should shock nobody that the same ownership of the New York Post is the same ownership of Fox News, which...
Right. And that's interesting that, again, don't want to overdo these comparisons with the Thompson book, but she spends more time actually on Fox News than on the newspapers. Do you think that the print media had more impact in this particular incident than television?
It did, because television media, 24-hour television media, simply did not exist at this point, right? CNN was formed or founded in 1981, I believe. And then Fox News and MSNBC would not be created until the mid to late 1990s. So really, if you wanted to consume news in some way in 1984, the places you would go were your local newspaper and maybe an hour or so of nightly news television, the 5 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news, and maybe the 11 o'clock news. And you might catch that. And also NBC nightly news or CBS nightly news or whatever, the CBS evening news or whatever else. But there wasn't this constant round the clock diet of news. So when tabloids, some of which would come out more than once a day, but when tabloids said something and would have headlines like "Screams Ignored, She's Dead" in all 3-inch capital letters, or "A Night of Terror," talking about the 1977 New York City blackout, it had an effect on people and how they saw the city and how safe they felt. And so absolutely, newspapers had a profound impact on how people saw the world, but moreover, particularly the New York Post played a huge role in all of that at that time.
And when we're talking, of course, about tabloid politics, tabloid culture, Rudy Giuliani was a player.
Mm-hmm.
and a certain Donald Trump. Was a wonderful film a couple of years ago, The Apprentice, on Trump's beginnings politically and his association with Roy Cohn, or his education at the feet of Roy Cohn. Not literally, of course. Do Trump and Cohn come up here? Of course, Trump himself became notorious for many, many reasons, one of which was his association with the later Central Park jogger case.
Exactly. Trump does not come up a lot in my book, and that's he's a singular figure in American politics. I don't think anybody would dispute that, but he really doesn't come up in my book for a few reasons. He wasn't actively engaged on it in the same way that he was the Central Park jogger case, which was a few years later, number one. Number two, the one substantive reference to Trump in my book comes up in the context of handgun possession, where I interviewed a former executive of the NRA who just talked about what it meant to have a gun in New York in the 1980s, to have a permit for a firearm in New York in the 1980s. And he made the point that really only big, powerful people had guns. Like Eleanor Roosevelt was a handgun possessor in New York, as was Donald Trump. And he mentioned Trump by name. The only place where Donald Trump comes up much more is in my interview with Bernard Goetz, where he talks about how he feels aggrieved today in the same way that Donald Trump feels aggrieved. He feels that the media turned on him in the way that he feels that the media turned on Donald Trump. And he sort of seemed to evince a kinship with the president of the United States. That was quite interesting. But no, Trump is not, oddly enough, of all the sort of above the fold marquee figures in New York City politics, Donald Trump is one that doesn't come up a lot in 5 bullets.
Yeah, I'm not particularly disappointed on that. I think we talked too much about him anyway.
Yeah, and let me be clear, that was very appealing to me about writing the book. As someone on television, in the cable news crucible every day, I spent a lot of my energy thinking about and talking about Donald Trump. And it was nice to have a project like the book 5 Bullets, just to explore deeply a major subject that just was not so dependent on the president.
Yeah, if we had him on the show, he'd probably insist that he was central. Thompson believes that Goetz legitimized a certain kind of vigilantism. I'm going to play another clip. Suggesting then that the Goetz case legitimized vigilantism?
I mean, in a lot of key ways it did, which is one of the reasons why a very recent case in New York just a few years ago was another subway killing of a homeless man on the New York subway system. And immediately everyone invokes Goetz. And when Kyle Rittenhouse goes to trial, people invoke Goetz because in part people are sort of saying, look, he was a hero then.
So the Rittenhouse case, again, another one that you're all too familiar with. Is Thompson right? Did Goetz make vigilantism acceptable?
I don't know if Bernard Goetz made vigilantism cool. I mean, America has long had a fixation on vigilantes. And, look, the data are quite clear on sort of how white people versus black people are treated in the criminal justice system for committing the same crimes. And that's just literally look at the data, look at sentencing data for people convicted of homicides, the way juries and often judges react to the same conduct. So, so I would say that, it's interesting on the point about Daniel Penny, the subway choker, with the incident in which Daniel Penny, there was an incident in which a Michael Jackson impersonator was on the train acting erratically. Daniel Penny took Jordan Neely. Daniel Penny took him down in a chokehold, ultimately kills him with the chokehold and gets acquitted. Well, a big why Bernard Goetz comes up so much in that case is that the governing law in New York on self-defense was a case called State versus Goetz. And I talk about this quite a bit in the book 5 Bullets, this idea that the case went all the way up to the highest court in the state of New York on the definition of quote unquote reasonabness. When is someone's fear reasonable enough to legitimize an action that they took or a violent crime or a violent act, not necessarily a violent crime that they committed. And it literally came right out of the Bernard Goetz case. And so the other point I would make is that, New York City in the 1970s and 1980s also, pardon me, pop culture in the 1970s and 1980s also legitimized and very much celebrated vigilantism. The reason
Taxi
why,
Driver.
Taxi Driver, The Warriors, even Saturday Night Fever is about sort of this hellscape that is 1970s, 1980s New York. But the big one you left out is Death Wish. And the reason why Bernard Goetz, I think within 48 hours of the shooting, begins being referred to as the Death Wish Vigilante by the New York Post. And that name took hold was because of the similarities between the vigilantism in the movie Death Wish way back in 1977, 1971. I can't remember what year Death Wish was, but it was a few years before. Point being, America has long had a fetish for the armed avenger who claps back, who's usually a white man, and gets celebrated for doing that which the police have failed or chosen not to do.
Was justice done then, Elliot?
Was justice done? I mean, so let me say this. I mean, there's a difference between legal justice and moral justice. And this is where I go at the end of the book, 5 Bullets. There are legal verdicts that can be justified based on the jury's application of law to fact. But the mere fact that a legal decision might be sound does not mean that a moral one has been made. And the point, and Al Sharpton makes this point quite beautifully in my book, 5 Bullets. Al Sharpton says, I'm not here to defend these boys in particular, or I'm not here for them. If they committed an unlawful act or if they behaved in an inappropriate manner, they should be held accountable as well. That does not entitle you to, quote, and this is Al Sharpton's words, blow their brains out. And so, sure, justice was done in the sense that a duly sworn jury considered the evidence. And there's a book by Mark Leslie, one of the jurors, that lays out their rationale. I don't agree with some of it, but I wasn't in the room. That lays out their rationale for acquitting Goetz, and the law supported it. Appeals supported it, or pardon me, it's supportable in law. But does anybody deserve to be brain damaged or paralyzed from the mid chest down as a result of that? Of course not. And people, when legitimizing legal decisions, tend to shunt away what really happened. Like, do we think that even if Troy Canty, the first individual to have approached Goetz, that even if he had approached him in a threatening manner, or was, an elevated tone or whatever.
What did he do? He asked him for $5.
Yeah. Or we're doing, well, let's pretend, imagine he demanded $5, which was certainly the theory that the jury went with and what Goetz claimed, that an imminent mugging was coming. Okay. Let's stipulate to that. Let's agree to that. Does he deserve to be shot and seriously injured? And God forbid, Daryl Cabey, the fourth one, who no testimony or evidence suggests approached Goetz at all, just happened to be in the group of friends or the group of 4 people. Does Daryl Cabey deserve to be brain damaged and paralyzed as a result of that? And no one, I think, if they really thought about it, would think that, is that truly an eye for an eye? It's a bizarre and perverse way of thinking about what justice is and means. And we in America fall into that trap quite a bit, of hiding behind the soundness of legal decisions, but not really unpacking what the moral ones mean.
So as you said earlier, we can't look at this in a colorblind way, rather like perhaps the OJ case. What should we remember? What should we take away? I mean, the legal stuff probably, even if you're wearing your legal hat, probably isn't that important a legacy. What are the real legacies historically, Elliot, for you about this case?
I think the stories that we know well and think we know well are far more complex than we thought, or that we think. And case in point, very few people have a nuanced view of the Bernard Goetz case trial shooting. Right? It's either vigilantism run amok and a racist homicidal maniac, or these 4 blameless young men who, my God, how could this possibly have happened? And I just don't think there is a lot of nuance in the way many people over the years have seen this shooting. And I would say it's far more complex than that. Goetz is a far more complex figure than I think the public many people would want to let on, starting with his use of ethnic slurs in public, in front of other people many times. And so it just this, or at least one very high profile instance of ethnic slurs, right? A little more complicated than all these folks who want to rush to defend him would seem to suggest. Now, obviously, the four young men had complicated backgrounds and ugly criminal histories, not entitling them to being injured or harmed or attacked in any way. But I just think everything is more complex than we think it is. I think this the latest instance of rash action that America's grappling with, Minneapolis, is far more complex than people wish to believe. And I think the rush to judgment, particularly from the White House right now, over fully exonerating the officer, not recognizing that there's at a minimum a factual question as to whether his actions were proper, is sort of how we roll in the United States. And I think that was the case here. So I just think there's far more nuance to the world than we want to let on.
Yeah. And your friends at the New York Post have a particularly short, sharp headline on that case.
Yeah.
Has anything changed at all? I mean, the whole point of writing these histories is either to point out that everything's changed or nothing's changed. A couple of years ago, I had Christian Cooper on the show. He himself was the victim of certainly a very unpleasant racializing experience where a white woman accused him of a crime he didn't do. Has anything changed over the last 50 or 40 years, Elliot? Since
of course things have changed, but the question is, what do we mean when we say changed, and what would true change look like? Are we still grappling with what I say in the book is America's racist past, present, and future? Of course. But even, and I talk about this in the book, 5 Bullets, even over the arc of the Bernard Goetz story, things changed for us and for him. Bernard Goetz later in the 1990s is put on trial by one of the victims for his injuries and is sued for, I believe it's $50 million for his injuries. Now, number one, the jury is in the Bronx. Number two, it's predominantly Black and Latino. Number three, race was a central component in the trial. And number four, New York City was just a different place in 1996 and 1997 than it was back in 1984. And people there was in the water far more of an appetite for thinking about race and inequality than there was back in 1984. Now, is America all fixed, and are the kinds of systemic issues that certainly characterize all of the 1980s in New York, have they all rectified and fixed and changed over time? No, absolutely not. But of course, it was just a different world than it was in 1984. Just looking at even crime statistics, where you were talking about homicide rates in 1970s and 1980s New York that were hovering around 2,000 a year, that are literally less than 20 or around 25% of that now. It's just a different world than it was back then.
And what about on the broader political stage? We had John Gantz on the show a couple of years ago. His book, When the Clock Broke, Con Men, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s, about the rise or centralization of some KKK characters. Do you think that the Gertz case had any impact, Elliot, on the broader politics in America from Reagan onwards through to Trump?
To some extent. I mean, I think the thing that probably has the biggest impact on politics now is, more than anything else, the internet, social media, and algorithms. If there's anything driving how America approaches politics now, it's the fact that we can self-segregate into communities that agree with us, to news sources that validate our points of view, and continue to be fed that information. I actually think it's radicalizing people far more than anything else that came out of the 1980s. And it's only accelerating. And the mere fact, and I talk about this in the book, 5 Bullets, the mere fact that you mentioned Kyle Rittenhouse, the mere fact that Kyle Rittenhouse was likely fed a steady stream of images of Kenosha, Wisconsin burning from friendly voices on whether it was TikTok or Instagram or Facebook or whatever else, that played some role in whipping him up to cross state lines and ultimately engage in the actions he did. You can't tell me that in the 1980s, only reading the Kenosha newspapers once a day, or pardon, the Illinois newspapers once a day where he lived, or the nightly news, that he necessarily would have felt so compelled to drop everything he was doing, cross state lines, pick up an AK-47 and join in the fight. And stories like that are all too common now, where merely by living in echo chambers, people are, I actually think, getting more radicalized.
Finally, Elliot, you grow up with a certain narrative. As you said, we can't come to this colorblind. Black Americans, white Americans have very different takes on what happened or what could have happened. You've put a lot of work into this. You've researched it extensively. What changed your mind? Is there anything that you went into this project thinking about the Gertz case that, having spent some years researching and writing the book, now you think differently on? What surprised you most about the research of the book and the case?
I think one thing that surprised me quite significantly was Bernard Goetz himself. I interviewed him for the book 5 Bullets. I think
right. By the way, jumping in here, when did you interview him, and what was, very briefly, what was the experience like?
March 1st, 2024, I got on the phone with him. It was one of the more bizarre conversations I've had in my life. And he doesn't do a lot of interviews. I don't think he's, I don't think he's interviewed for any book that's come out over these 4 decades that he's sort of agreed to participate in. But I got him to talk to me, and how unrepentant he remains about the shooting. A line he said to me that I put prominently in the book is, those guys needed shooting, for starters. That's not why I shot them, but they absolutely needed shooting. And I did a social media post, with an audiogram of that clip because it's very chilling. 1, 2, how obsessed with Mario Cuomo Bernard Goetz is. He really seems to see, and I'm not surprised by this. I think we all are shaped by the political leaders who were leaders in our formative years of thought. And Mario Cuomo, who I talk about a bunch in the book 5 Bullets, Mario Cuomo was, I believe, Secretary of State and ran for mayor and was governor over the course of the 1970s and 1980s, and constantly, for Bernard Goetz, the face of what he regarded as the decline and decay of New York, and also politicians' lack of care about public safety. So I just think it was enlightening to speak to someone who is not afraid to say the quiet part out loud about race to a Black man he's never met before, which I was particularly struck by, his lack of repentance and his lack of nuance. But conversely, something that I did find incredibly striking is his lucidity. He jumps around from a lot, topic to topic to topic. He was all over the place. Clearly a sharp guy, but it was whiplash. And I do talk about this in the penultimate chapter of the book 5 Bullets. I do talk about his just what it's like to talk to this sort of frenetic, unrepentant elderly mind.
Well, there you have it. Elliot's book is called 5 Bullets. He's mentioned that a few times. The story of Bernie Goetz, New York's explosive 80s, and the subway vigilante trial that divided the nation. It's the Rashomon, the story of Rashomon in New York of the 80s. Congratulations, Elliot, on the book.
Thank you.
Congratulations on being a week earlier than the Heather Ann Thompson book. And we'll get you back on the show. So much more, maybe not to talk about Gertz, but on so many other legal issues in America. Your mind is much sharper than Bernie Goetz's.
I don't know about that. He was pretty sharp. I mean, it's I think my mind's more coherent than Bernie Goetz's, but I was struck by his lucidity, and I say that in the book.